Yeah, thank you.
So for everyone who's coming in,
Hey, Camille.
we're happy that you're in the right place. If you can go ahead and start writing who you are, where you're coming from, and what your podcast is, or even just why you like podcasts. Why are you here? Maybe you don't have a podcast, but you have something to say. You can use the chat function in Whova. Let's see.
What's up, TT? Yes. Leslie.
And do you know everybody?
I mean,
I feel like
it was a nice big family from the first. I mean, Sean was like the MC doing everything, you know, organizing behind the scenes too. You know, we out here.
I guess we know who the social animal here is, though.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not.
Okay, we have Los Angeles. Some narrative. I love some good narrative storytelling. Yes.
Uchechi out in Greenville, South Carolina. I used to live there.
Oh, really? What?
I used to work for Michelin.
Ah.
Did you?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big employer here. Are you from Greenville? No.
Nah, I'm from Pennsylvania, but I went to school at University of South Carolina and then moved out to Greenville to work.
Oh, how long did you live there?
2 years.
Like recently or far away?
Nah, 2012 to 2014.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, haven't been back since, but I mean, it's a nice spot.
Is it?
Well, we'll talk offline.
Yeah, we'll talk offline.
What is it now? You could do worse without going too much further than Greenville.
Just don't travel too far out your neighborhood. Don't know what you're gonna find in Greenville. Okay, so we have Adjua, I hope so, from Brooklyn, Leslie from New Jersey, Adrian, aka TT, I think we've heard.
TT.
About TT. Ooh, a Pan-African podcast showcases the dope things and people in the community, funky and fresh, yes. This is someone's first Afros and Audios. It's been really great that you've been starting community.
Welcome.
Oh, someone from Atlanta, Georgia, host of the Diary of a Mad Black Woman. Okay, founder of the Black podcast. Well, we're loving it. Yeah.
Mad Black Man. Mad Black.
Oh, sorry.
And I was looking at that. I was like, man.
I got you, Blake. I got
that
you.
changed really quick.
I mean, I'm sorry.
We got you, Blake.
Because that one's the name of Tyler Perry's yet unaired podcast. Because he out there now.
Yes.
Wow.
I read and I was like, do we have copyrights to that name? All right, so I think it's actually a really good time to get started. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, my name is Uchechi Kalu. I'm your back end moderator. So when it comes time for questions and answers, I will read out your questions. So as you're listening to the conversation and you're hearing things, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to go deeper with that. I need to go deeper in the conversation called Going Deeper. Please go ahead and write those questions in the chat at the start, and then I can start collecting them and saying them for you at the appropriate time. So I'm gonna shut up and you guys can go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Chechi. Thank you so much for your help in making all this happen this morning. Hi, I'm Ibadi NX from the Candid Frame Photography Podcast. My show is about interviews with photographers, and it seems kind of antithetical to do a podcast about photography, but I've managed to make it work since 2006. So, and it really involves around conversations, not just about equipment, but about creativity, art, career, business. And I wanted to do this panel on interviewing conversations because I think there's a real art to it. And since so many podcasts revolve around engaging in conversations, I thought it would be a really good opportunity for myself and the other panelists to give our insights into what we have found really effective in terms of being a good interviewer and being a good conversationalist. So one of the things that I think that is really important, and I think you'll learn as a result of the conversation that we're going to have here, is that there is no one single way to interview someone or to have a conversation, especially over your audio. There's a real personal take that you have to adopt. You have to find your own way and what works for you individually. Um, I have found that after a lot of successes and a lot of mistakes. And there are certain things that I have found invaluable, and we just kind of try and have as concise a conversation here as we can, but also hopefully provide you some gems of wisdom that you can sort of take away. And what I'll do is I'll ask the first question, and then we'll have each of the other panelists, before they respond, just tell us a little bit about themselves, the name of their show, and about the podcast. So to begin, one of the things that I think is essentially important is the importance of research. And I got to break that down into 3 areas, and then any of my fellow panelists here can talk about the importance of these aspects. One is like knowing your subject. The other one is knowing your audience, because those two things can really determine the resulting questions in the dialogue that you have. I do a lot of extensive research on my own, on my guests. I try to be as familiar with their work as possible. But what I have an advantage of is because I've been a photographer and written about photography for so long, I'm really well versed in the subject matter. So I think it's a combination of your knowledge of the subject matter itself, your knowledge of the subject, and also who your audience is. And I think the latter is something people don't think about a lot when they think about interviewing someone, because you really got to know your audience to know what the right questions are. But let's start with Sean Moore from the Mindful Rebel podcast. Introduce yourself and what you think about that first part of the artful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's doing well this morning. My name is Sean Moore. I'm currently working with 2 different podcasts at the moment. So right now, I've been working with and on the Mindful Rebel podcast, a podcast that started about 4 years ago that dissects the intersection between mindfulness and leadership, which speaks directly to some of the work I do full-time and part-time, with teaching meditation, yoga, and then also working in the leadership and personal development space. Right now, I'm in the production process of a second podcast called the Sound Sangha Podcast with Yoga International, which is a podcast designed to demystify and educate folks on the different practices of sound healing, and what that practice is. And so for me, when I think about interviewing and some of the skillful aspects of that, I think you can't hammer any harder than the aspect of really drilling in and researching and knowing. I know sometimes it looks like when it comes to podcasting, we just kind of plop down in front of a computer, turn on Zoom, and we just kind of hop in a conversation. But there's so much pre-production work that should go into really researching and knowing who's in front of you to be able to ask the right sort of questions. I think the other point for me when I think about how I've structured, because I've listened to some of my old podcasts, I'm about 95 episodes in. I've listened to some of like the first 10 podcasts and I've kind of like cringed a little bit because I'm like, ooh, this was rough. But I've noticed even through listening to some of my older podcasts, my art of interviewing has evolved. And I think that really came into perspective of knowing my voice and what I'm, I guess, digging at when it comes to interviewing. For me in my podcast, it's about highlighting folks' journey along their own personal development and growth space. So, I've been in spaces where I've had a friend interview the same person I've interviewed, and I know that the conversations are going to be completely different because what I'm digging at or what I'm doing research around is really what steps got you to where you are today versus talking about your project right now or what successes are happening in your life right now. It's about the journey for me. So I think really leaning into doing that research, but also knowing what your, I guess, the crux of your conversation should be, I think has really helped guide that level of being able to have a really insightful conversation, and not leaning in so much of a kind of Q&A, but let's just talk and kind of create that space of safety in that conversation.
That's really good. Next is Nichelle Womack from the People Connect podcast.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nichelle from the People Podcast, and I am excited to be here to share with some information with you today regarding how skillful interview can really elevate your podcast conversation and reach. I've been podcasting for about 3 years now on one platform, and I just recently started another one, Love Thy Marriage. And I started that because of the excitement that I got from a Instagram portfolio. So I started to see people ask me questions about that. They wanted to know more information. And so I started another podcast from that generation. But People Connect podcast, basically we talk about business, lifestyle, and we also talk about the deep conversations that people refuse to have. And so we are currently right now expanding upon that. And I must say, as Sean mentioned, when I first did my podcast, I was nervous as heck, but I figured I had a platform and I needed to really engage with my audience and make them aware of what was going on, some situations with business and some things that they wanted to evolve in as business owners. On my personal level, I am a coach and I do help people to start, market, grow, and profit in their business. So that was leadership behind starting the People Connect podcast to be able to help them with that. In concurring with what others have said about interviewing, I think it's really clear that when you know your target audience, that you're able to really drill down and what's passionate to them, because it will really open up conversation in the interview. And I have 4 specifics that I always like to work with, and that's be engaging, be authentic, be direct, and do not hoodwink them. And what I mean by hoodwink is that make sure that they're prepared to answer what you are prepared to ask them, because I have found through listening to podcasts as well as my own, if people are not prepared to answer your questions, you're going to have a long gap of things not being said, and it can really throw people off and they not feel comfortable with you. And so I've learned to make people feel comfortable by getting to know them. I've also found it feasible to literally stalk them to see what they do, how they do it, and who they're connected to. Because I find when you find out who people are connected to, that leverage you to be connected to them as well. And so by stalking their social media platforms, going to LinkedIn, as others have mentioned earlier, Facebook, and literally just let people talk, because people will tell you everything you need to know, but you got to be prepared to listen. And that's what has helped me in engaging with my podcast and being on multiple platforms to just make people aware that it exists. They ask me questions and I use those as orders for my interviewing aspects with questions as well. So interviewing really is so multidimensional. And I always like to look at it as when you're going on a job interview. We're all uncomfortable going on a job interview and what questions the interviewer is going to ask us. Put yourself in that seat as well and make sure to make the people not only feel comfortable, but engage with you as well, too.
Oh, thank you for that, Nichelle. So Jerry the Third from the Point Noir podcast.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this session. Glad to see you all, some familiar faces. I'm Jerry the Third, host of the Point Noir podcast. We are the only podcast that focuses on travel adventures of men of color. And as we build this catalog of stories and inspiration, we also sponsor men of color to get their passports. And the project launched off as a direct result of the life experiences I had. I had so much growth by traveling internationally, and I basically created the resource I wish I had before I decided to live undocumented in Paris for a year and a half. Stories for later. But specifically when it comes to interviewing and research, it seems like I might be the loosest researcher out of the group. I follow my guests on social media, and because I want to get a sense of just like who they are as a person. And I've found that being hands-on on that part of the process makes the rest of the show completely easy, because I'm able to use my discernment to get a feel about, okay, what kind of person is this that I'm inviting on my platform, and how aware might they be of their own experiences to share something with my audience. So I think research is important, but I don't go super deep into research. I get enough to get a few facts, and then I want to dive into whatever occurs naturally during the interview. And speaking of the word interview, I don't even phrase them as interviews. When I talk to my guests and pitch them on coming on the show, it's a conversation. We're just two cats chatting. Imagine two adventurers, the people who travel love to tell stories. So I imagine these being cafe style conversations where, we're sitting across from each other at a bar or at a cafe somewhere. And I try to keep it that familiar. So by leaving some things out, by not researching them to death, I get the opportunity to be inspired in the moment while I'm interviewing them. And it really produces some beautiful, organic points of interaction that I think my audience really likes.
Yeah. And I think one of the important things to always be aware of when you're doing a podcast that relies on conversations is the idea that most people that you're interviewing are not completely comfortable with speaking into a mic. Whether or not they're just completely new to podcasting and they just discovered what it was when you gave them a call, or people who have been interviewed until the cows come home. Everyone, except for a very small amount, have a certain level of discomfort. So you're the one responsible for doing the heavy lifting. And I think that you doing your research and going in and keeping your hands on the reins is really, really essential. One of the things that you'll notice about all the panelists here is whatever subject matter that they're talking about for respect for their podcast, they have a passion about it. They have an understanding about it. They can hold their own in terms of a conversation about not just the guests, but the subject matter. And that is the means by which you can really put the person who's a guest on your show really comfortable. And for me, one of the things that I try to do is that my first question is the one that I think about the most. I don't work from a list of questions, but I ruminate over and over. What's my lead-in going to be? Because I don't want to lead in with, "Oh, how'd you get started?" Because for me, that's a lazy question. And if you have someone who has been interviewed a lot, they've heard that question a lot. And you don't want them to just give you a pat answer. I don't want them to give me a pat answer because, I want them, when they hear that first question, to go, "Oh, snap. He knows something about me. He knows something of what about I'm interested in." And I think that speaks to what Nichelle was saying about being engaging and being authentic, right? Because that's so important in being able to do that. That's why sort of the research, your first question, how you connect with them is so important, because you want that half hour, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, however long that you're talking with them, to seem like it's just going by in a snap. So along with the research, what else do you guys find that are really sort of important and effective for it to feel like a conversation between you and your guests? We'll start with you, Jerry.
Could you repeat the specific question again? Was it what makes things feel organic?
What do you feel? What is? Yeah, let me start. What do you feel is your strength or something that you bring to what you do that helps people to feel like, oh, this is a conversation rather than me just being me having to field a bunch of questions?
Got you. One of the ways I do that, which eliminates a ton of work, is I don't work with a script. I don't have any pre-scripted questions. Everything is really organic off the spot. And it's funny that you mentioned not having kind of like a pad question, because all my guests, they all get the same first question: is how did you become an adventurer? What was your origin story? But here's how it works on my platform, because if you are a Black man who has traveled internationally, you're already in such rare air that we can build up through the complexity through the rest of the discussion. I'm not asking you, how did you get into becoming an accountant, or, how did you, adopt a puppy? Like, it's things that are already off the beaten track. And that first question a lot of times forces these men to reconceptualize what they've actually done, because they don't often have a sense of just how uncommon they are. So by asking them, what's your adventure origin story? Now we've added a little bit of fun. It kind of reminds you of comics a little bit. And now they're like, wait a second, I know I took this one trip. He's not asking me about specific highlights of my trip. He wants to know kind of how I arrived here. And by kind of starting from that point, it opens up a way that, we're just exploring all of this together. And I think it kind of brings this energy that allows for a lot of openness. and a lot of interesting points to come out, because they try to be prepared, especially if they're more, practiced with interviewing. But I'm very happy to throw screwball questions in there, because I find things I'm captivated with in the story. Like, wait a second, like, what drove you to save up the money to get on a flight and then take this PTO from you? Like, that don't make sense, bro. Like, run that back for me. That's what a lot of my show is.
And Nichelle?
Well, first off, I always try to, as I mentioned earlier, study them. And when I'm looking at their social platform, it kind of enables me to learn a little bit more about their background. And my question is, tell me a little bit more of yourself, because people love to talk about themselves. And when you allow them to talk, you kind of generate questions from the conversation that they've shared with you. One in particular, one interview that did, I gone to their social platform pages and even looked at their bio, their website, and things of that nature, and found out that they had a love for travel as well. And they had some extent travel that, me being a traveler too, wanted to more, learn more about it, and found that that was part of their passion, enabled them to start their business. And so, based on what I see them do, how they do it, ask them about their passion, and they generate those questions, or it helps me generate the question to ask them in the process. And, I always like to let people are not born great interviewers, they become one over time. And the more you do it, and the more you get connected with your audience, and audience that you want to connect to, the more leverage that you have to elevate your viewing skills, as well as make your guests feel comfortable.
Yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I was going to say, just to expound off of Nichelle and Jerry's point, I think that sometimes, depending on the topic, that base or entry question, I think, can be helpful. Because I think it does create I think it creates comfortability in the conversation, right? Because before you drill into something hard, heavy, if you ask somebody about just a general foundational question about themselves, it makes it a little easier for them. Everybody loves to talk about themselves, right? So it makes it a little easier for them to ease into conversations that may be a little bit more difficult. But I also know that I think when we're dealing with topics that may be a little bit more niche, sometimes that entry point to their work is the area of interest. And so that does kind of provide that space for you to start drilling into, because, people will provide bios, right? But in reality, it can't capture all of who they are in that way. So if you allow them to start to expound on that information, I think it does give you space to like, that's an interesting thing that you didn't mention in your bio. Let me pull at that and pull that into my area, my questions that I'm developing or that I have in front of me. So I think it does help you develop. I think it serves two kind of areas of purpose. It helps you develop maybe additional questions once they get comfortable, and it does provide a little ease into the conversation, especially if you're interviewing folks that are new to interviewing or haven't necessarily interviewed quite often. What I will say, though, is if you do get, and I know we're all tapping in, some folks tap into similar demographics, and there are some folks that, depending on the topic in which they're speaking on, are like doing the podcast circuit, right? Like they're on a few different podcasts,
Right.
and you're probably getting asked the same question. I think once you do your research and notice that maybe you're interviewing somebody that is kind of in that space where they've done like 4 or 5 podcasts, for me, what I've noticed is I need to go back and listen to some of their other interviews so that I don't pull on those same threads. Because for me, it's important to now differentiate this conversation with person X versus their other conversations that they've had across the board. So for me, it just depends on who's sitting in front of me or virtually in front of me, where it's, if you're in that podcast circuit, you're interviewing frequently, how do I now make this conversation stand out a little bit more different than maybe some of your other conversations that you've had kind of moving forward?
Yeah. And I love what you said earlier about how you understand that your podcast is about recognizing the journey, sort of the story. And I think that's really essential for all of us as podcasters to understand that regardless of the subject matter that we've chosen, that it's not just about the subject matter, that it's not just about photography or about traveling or about real estate or whatever the subject matter is. Because if you come from that, you end up asking the typical questions. You ask everything that's sort of expected. And if you understand that what podcasting affords us is a way to get really personal and intimate insight into each other's journey. And that is what makes can make a podcast really special. That level of intimacy is not something you're going to hear on a morning news show or on, morning radio or anything like that, because everyone has sort of an agenda. They obviously have a time limit, which we don't, which can be a real strength. But I think that understanding that there's a story there, and that people may not necessarily always like, repeating their spiel, but people do love telling their story. And I think that's really at the heart of it. And one of the other things that I think is essentially important is the active listening. I don't work from a list of questions, because I tried it once and it was just like I would ask the question and then I would look at my pad and I realized I had stopped listening. And it's like, no, I can't do that. So I try to just stuff in my brain as much knowledge as I can, have that first question, and I just stay focused. And I think that one of the things that provides you is the essential follow-up question. When someone gives you an answer, not just jumping to the next question on your list. And that provides two things. One, it proves to your guest that you're listening, right? And two, it leaves the conversation open to surprises. Because people inevitably, once they start talking, they're not completely conscious of everything that they're sharing. And if you're listening and if you've done your research, you'll hear a little tease of something. And it's like, oh, can we go back to this? Can you dig a little deeper there? And then people start really having to think about what they're sharing. And that's when, for me, is where the gems are found. That's where the gold is found, can be in those follow-up questions. And if you haven't done your research and you're not listening, you miss those opportunities. Nothing drives me crazy than someone who's interviewing someone that I would love to interview, and they're just going through a list of questions. I just want to scream, because they'll say something. I go, God, you just missed something, which drives me nuts. But let's have you guys talk about that. Why don't we start with you, Nichelle?
Well, I think going back to what you did, I mean, having a list really kind of puts you in a box. Whereas if you're more open with the conversation and listening, you do hear, as I mentioned, people love to talk about themselves and what they do. And so if you are open to your thought process and in your conversation, then you'll be able to expound on it as well. Now, I do come prepared with at least 4 to 12 things that I want to ask them, but it never goes that way. And I think with anything, what you plan, you have a plan, because if you fail, you fail to plan. And if you're not really positioned to really expound on it, then you do miss those opportunities. And I think really when we look at people and who we want to interview, I always try to get people that are in my sector that I want to learn from. And by interviewing them, I do learn from them. And I ask those tough questions that have asked of me. And I look at my audience too, because I think when you look at the audience, you'll really categorize how your questions are asked and who you choose to interview. And so by asking questions, find out what my target audience is lacking, and how I can pick that slack by getting someone that can answer their question onto my platform. As I mentioned, I talk about business, real estate, lifestyle, and those questions in between. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know until you bring it up in question, or have the process of them answering what has been lingering on for quite some time. So that has been my navigation aspect as far as getting around all of that and being able to pigeonhole and not get caught up in the box by asking so many questions and not allowing my guests to speak.
Sean?
Yeah, Nichelle brought up a lot of really great points. I think the first thing I want to tap into is the great thing about podcasting is we have a lot of control and flexibility over who we have in front of us to be in conversation with. So you should be excited by the person that you're conversing with. So one of the things one of my pet peeves of listening to podcasts is like, you listening to someone in conversation with another person. It's like, are you even excited about this? Like, is this even interesting? Because then that filters in to, as a listener, of what you're getting from the podcast. So for me, when I'm interviewing people, literally I'm pulling from people that I'm like, damn, I think this will be an interesting conversation. I want to talk to them. So, that helps in that excitement. But I think one of the things I've noticed that in my evolution of interviewing, I've moved from prescribed questions to list of topics, because I noticed that, in terms of active listening, I get locked and gridlocked into this list of questions in front of me. So to your point, I'll start tuning out because I'm like, okay, when are they going to stop? Okay, the next question. Okay, I'm ready for the next question. They stop talking, versus just sitting back listening and seeing if they're going to tap into some of the topics. And if I see an entry point, or I see another, topic that they're speaking about with passion, then let me craft a question around that, versus looking at this pre determined. Because in listening to past podcasts, I've listened, I'm like, damn, I missed the point for another question. Like, that would have been interesting to drive down into, but I didn't, because I was gridlocked into this list of questions that I created. So for me, it's been a lot less about questions and coming up with a list of topics that I feel like would create some interest with the person that I'm speaking with.
Okay, Jerry?
I think there's a theme that keeps coming up here about being a subject matter expert, really knowing your stuff. And on my platform, that's what I leverage to get these moments of depth. In terms of travel experience, a lot of times my experience has a lot more depth than my guests have had. So by kind of revealing these additional layers that they might have experienced and not really processed, we get to these moments of like true authenticity or true discovery, which makes things really exciting. And I think overall, if you're checking out this session, trying to learn how to be a better interviewer, there is a point where structure does matter. If you're starting out with your show, your first 10 episodes, as Sean mentioned, use that structure. If you're new to your topic, I think it's beautiful if you start a show and you don't know anything about it. It's great to bring on experts and you learn along the way, but somewhere as you progress, you start to move from needing that structure and that framework to developing your own subject matter expertise and start leveraging that. That's really your superpower, because that is not only going to highlight your unique voice and way of communicating these experiences, but that's going to make your content stand out from anybody else. As long as I'm on my show doing my hosting, I don't have to worry about competition or someone repeating the same interview twice, because no one else has the experience sets that I have, and they haven't developed them in conversation the same way I have. So definitely, I think there's a place for structure and questions. And if you want to get some points out from your guests, that's fantastic. But learn to trust yourself through the process as you continue to grow, because that, I think, is ultimately where your sauce as a host and a deep interviewer is going to come from.
Yeah. Because I was interviewing people well before I started a podcast, because I was writing magazine articles, I was pretty accustomed to interviewing people. Largely was over the phone, and then just the recording it over the microphone just became just sort of an extension of that. But even after all this time of interviewing people, I always get nervous right before an interview. That has not stopped. Especially if it's someone who I've been following for years, who I've been wanting to get on the show for a decade, and finally get them on. And it's just like my butterflies, and if I had hair in my head, it'd be falling out. It would just I just get really anxious. But once I get into the conversation, I'm good. But I think that one of the things I'm really curious about is with everyone, and I'll just share my experience, is that despite the fact that the nervousness doesn't go away, I've gained a lot of confidence by having done it as much as I have. And more importantly, I've discovered what works for me. Because I've listened to a lot of other podcasters, a lot of other radio interviewers, television interviewers. And, at first I thought that, I should do what this person's doing or that person's doing. And I found that it really wasn't a good fit for me. Right, that I had to find what was true to me, that was authentic, that was genuine, that really allowed me to sort of be myself rather than some radio, disc jockey from Cincinnati or something. But it took me a while to finally get comfortable in my own skin in front of the mic. And I would just love to hear from you guys in terms of what that journey has been like for you. And I just leave it open to anyone who wants to share on that.
I'll hop in. My first 10 or so were rough. I felt like I need to have a big announcer voice, like big, radio energy. Welcome to the Point Noir podcast. And that's fine. It's a good place to start. And kind of as I do with anything, try stuff out. Always be in the mode. I look at things like a continuous science experiment. I'm always experimenting. And my signal to myself for what's working, what's not, is what do I have the energy to maintain? So by the time I hit episode 12 and I was fatigued trying to create this persona, I was like, shit, let's just take it back a little bit. Let's take the pressure off. Let what's naturally resonating with you come out, and let's try this approach. So I'm always looking for resonance in ways that I have the least amount of resistance. What is actually energizing me through this process, from my research process to my time with my guests, my questions, everything. It's okay to start one way, because we all have these images, and I pick up things all the time from other amazing podcasters and events like this, and try it out for a little bit. You don't have to commit to it long time. It doesn't have to be a whole change of character, but if it works for you, keep it. And if it doesn't, discard it. And by kind of going through this constant refinement, I've arrived to where I am now, and it's work. It is work. And when I'm coaching podcasting, I let people know that, like, you might come to a point where you're like, I thought this was a cute idea, but it's too much work. And that's fine too. But if you're energized through it, if you're finding that it's an outlet for creative expression, you're going to be willing to put the work in. And now your journey really becomes personal and starts to mean so much more than just putting out more content into the internet.
Things are going really quickly. Uchechi, do we have any questions at all in the chat?
We don't have any questions yet, but I think
Okay.
There must be questions rumbling.
All right. Well, feel free. We got a little time, but Nichelle, please, on this idea of finding your personal voice in terms of interviewing.
Well, in regards to finding my personal voice, nobody can beat me and me. And I live by that motto. I'm not perfect. I think what my struggle was when I first started, I've always growing up, I wanted to be an anchor woman. I've been a radio host and all of that. And, just in conversation and meditation and things, and people would always say you have that comforting voice. I didn't see it because I personally think I'm loud. And my family told me that. My husband, my kids are like, Mom, you're loud. So it really took some time for me to say, am I comfortable with really putting myself out there? And that's really what you have to do. Put yourself out there. Nobody can beat you being you. And if you just be authentic, you share what you have, people resonate and connect with people they have some similarity to and some that they don't. You will find that in podcasting, when people tell me they heard my podcast, or they didn't know I had a podcast, or they download and were excited, or I've even had some say, well, perhaps maybe you should do it this way. I'm always open for listening. But when it boils down to, it's your podcast. And again, it's not all about you, but being that the podcast is your podcast, you have to find your true self. And that really has allowed me to not be afraid. Fear is natural, but you have to get around fear by building your confidence. As long as you're confident and you know who you are and understand, can't nobody you at being you, I think that can expound on everything else.
Sean?
Yeah, I think to echo the sentiments of the panelists, I really think, one of the things when we think about, I have a marketing background too, is when I think about, people are always drawn to like authenticity, right? And so, it's good to study other interviewers. I'm the kind of person, I'm always tapped in other podcasts. I listen to other interviews like Hot 97 and folks on MSNBC. I listen to other interviewers to, observe their style and look. But one of the things for me that's really important is really just leaning into your own voice. And, I've done, as Jerry mentioned, like looking at other podcasts and you're like, well, damn, maybe I should add another segment, or maybe I should do this. You try it. I'm like, I don't feel good. It's just about, let's just lean into the conversation, because then it starts to morph into something else that isn't authentically what you want to do specifically for this podcast, or it may birth another, podcast, or it might birth another thing that you might be able to work on. But I think it's really knowing the purpose of your podcast and leaning heavily into that. And I think that should guide and dictate how you show up in your specific platform. For me, one of the things when I'm thinking about authenticity too is making sure that you do whatever you need to do to ground yourself in preparation for the conversation. And for me, it's big, and this big on creating space, 10 or 15 minutes before, to sit, meditate, relax. Part of doing that research ahead of time eases some of that anxiety, but I do think that anxiety is kind of just baked into, preparing to just be in conversation with someone else. But whatever thing helps, ground you in a specific way, make sure you incorporate that into your process, because that allows you to step into the interview kind of clear, balanced, and kind of grounded on even keel, so that you can be, fully immersed in the conversation.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And Michelle just said something that just really just struck home for me in terms of, how she was described by my family members, right? Instead of, mom, you're being too loud and all these things. And she's just like, this is just me, And there's something to be said for you sort of embracing you as the host and the producer of your podcast. Because the way I look at my podcast is like, this is my house, right? And when I'm in my house, I am my natural self, funky and free. I don't have to answer to anybody else. I don't have to adopt, any sort of airs. And I think it's really kind of important for you to consider your podcast as your home. And with that in mind, in terms of who you choose to have on the show. I get a lot of solicitation at this point for people who want to appear on the show, and not all of them do I welcome onto my program, because sometimes I think people have an agenda because they want to sell, and they want to sell something, or I just genuinely don't have an interest in what they have to share. And I think that part of being a good host and a good conversationalist is understanding that the space that you're providing for your guest and for your listener is a precious one, because people could be spending their time doing a heck of a lot. So let's talk about the importance of being really considerate about who you choose to sit down with to have a conversation. And Sean, let's start with you.
Sure. That's a really it's a good question to ask, and I think to your point about this is the space that you've created. I think it's good to set expectations around what it is, but I do think that this is where doing the research ahead of time comes in, right? So I know early on in my podcasting, there were people I wanted to talk to because I'm like, oh, they were buzzing at the moment that they released something or they did something, and I was like, ooh, let me run and have a conversation with them. Not really realizing that, one, they might not be too familiar with my platform, with the type of questions that I ask. And I didn't do a good job at setting the expectations of what the conversation is. So I would get into, and I noticed there's a question in there, how to pivot from a bad interview, right? Where sometimes that might lead to that kind of interview where you're like, oh my God, how much longer do we got? Or how do I, you know what I mean? I've had about 2 or 3 of those, right? And for me, it's making the difficult decision about, do I air this? Do I, and I've knocked that expectation out, because part in my intake form is, there is no guarantee that this episode will air based off of the content of the conversation, right? So for me, I look at that as, it drives home the importance of doing the research ahead of time. Now I've even gone to a point where I would like, for folks that I'm interested in interviewing, I try to see if I've heard them speak somewhere else first. And if I haven't, I always do an entry-level conversation ahead of time first, where it's like, let's just have an alignment call and see if this is something that you're interested in. And, I always frame it from the perspective of, let's chat so I can tell you more about the podcast. That gives me a little second to do a little bit of pre-interviewing, to ask some more questions, and see how they handle some of those questions as well. Because for me, I never want to put a dud up where it's like, if I didn't get anything from it, I mean, I'm just being honest. If I didn't get
I feel you.
Yeah, if I sat and I didn't get anything from it, I don't want to make my listeners strain to feel like, wow, they didn't get something from it either. So, I think putting up some of those barriers and kind of constraints around the safe space that you've created with your podcast, I think is really, really important. And that's something that I've done a lot more with this new podcast, is that I'm letting people know it's like, this conversation is designated for the first season of Sound Song, a podcast. However, based on the content, this episode may or may not air in the first season. So that gives me that little leeway to say, maybe this one might not. But again, it goes into leaning heavily into researching and learning as much about the person to see how they would show up in the space in which you're creating for your podcast.
Nice. It looks like we got a question. So, what's the question and who's it from?
So this question is from Leslie Faison. They ask, if you were interviewing someone who has done a lot of interviews, how do you come up with questions that no one has asked and ask them in a way that elicits a different response than they would normally give?
Jerry, Nichelle, would either of you like to respond to that?
I'll let Nichelle take it because no one is interviewing the people I'm interviewing.
Well, I look at hot buttons, things that will literally generate conversation. A lot of times we've been talking about questions, a serious question, and sometimes missed opportunity when I go back and research where the people have been before and the type of questions to ask. I get hot buttons throughout the conversation, pin things that were not expounded upon. And there I'm able to really dive in to what needs to be asked, because you will find that throughout listening with other people that do ask the same questions. And then I go back, people to talk about themselves. Sometimes you may find yourself kind of hearing off track, but it really dive into really having that connection with when my ultimate goal every time I get a mic is to set my guests for success. And by setting them up success for myself, well, because people listen to it, then that's more notoriety to my podcast. And, hey, I want to interview with a person. So going back and listening, and even going back stalking him, looking at their social profile. Instagram is one of my favorites. I like Facebook, but sometimes it's not, but I stay in news. Okay. By getting in news, you get questions that people have asked that they need to answer to. And so that listening to these that I try to bring on, I try to dive into that way and making them feel comfortable, again, to the grain by asking them questions they have not addressed or expounded on from other interviews.
I personally find that if I remember that what I'm trying to do is act as if I am sitting in a couch with someone with no mics, that what would I want to learn from this person if I was just chatting with them and I wasn't, quote unquote, interviewing them? And if I come from sort of a really genuine place myself, in terms of what I really kind of want to know, that sort of leads to a real conversation, and not the questions that end up being, cliched. And I think ultimately, it comes back to what we've talked about earlier about doing all your research in terms of the subject matter and your subject. So, because if you haven't done that, you'll just fall back on the questions that you've heard a bunch of other people ask. We're running out of time, but so really quickly, is there any advice, resources, tips that people want to leave with people who have joined us this morning? I'll start off. There's a great podcast by Jesse Thorne, who does the Bullseye with Jesse Thorne. It's a show that's on Bullseye. And he did this podcast a couple of years ago called The Turnaround. And it is an interview with interviewers like Katie Couric and a bunch of other people. It is a marvelous graduate school on interviewing. It's amazing what you'll learn listening to how different people approach the art of the interview. So check that out. So Sean, any advice or resources that you want to pass on?
Yeah, I would say for me, the best piece of advice is, how do you create, we think about these platforms as, spaces or environment that we create. Is like, what's the best way to create a safe space for you and your your interviewer. So, you know, how do you make that person feel comfortable? How do you balance in your own comfort? And how can you not make it feel as formal, right? Because I think one of the things we've all been talking about is like this, there's ownership in your platform, right? We're not necessarily at a space where like we're doing, you know, formal interviews for a specific company. And maybe if your podcast is, there's something to think about too. But, you know, this typically is something that's sparked by our own personal interests. So is how can we start to think about this in a way that we're creating a really safe space for ourselves and the person that we're chatting with in front of us? Because I think once we create that safe space, we're able to let those guards fall down. And I think there's some organic magic that happens once people's guards are down, and they feel comfortable enough to kind of converse. And I think that's sometimes the difference between, you know, an interview that you're like, oh, that's cool, and those really magical interviews is that both folks feel comfortable, and that allows people to just to really be in their element and start to pull at some unique threads that start to really create some magic with the information that's being shared.
Yeah, thank you. Jerry?
Yeah, in terms of some last words for advice, I think Sean hit on something really great. Space is fantastic. When we call it hosting, we call it interviewing, but what I do is I hold space for men of color who travel, space for them to express themselves, space for them to rediscover themselves. And I see hosting as an act of service to my guests as well as my audience. So I'm in the in-between. And by being conscientious that I not only want to honor my guests and their experiences and validate them and hype them up, but also have lessons and things to share with my audience, that really keeps me in an open kind of awareness where kind of anything flows. It just allows me to get my ego out of the way. And when it comes to your podcast in general, be really clear on why you're doing this. When I coach people, and if you want a podcast just for blasting out your business marketing message and getting clients, that's one focus of interviewing. But if you're really trying to get to know people and, polish and rediscover these aspects of humanity and just life, then you're going to be diving deep like we are today. So be clear on why you're showing up, because you're going to show up differently if you're stressed about how many leads you're going to get from an episode versus just honoring some awesome time with somebody that you're already excited to interview.
And Nichelle?
I would just say be true to you and what you do, and realize that it's not all about you, because the message that you give in podcast league could change one's life. Going back to what I do about business, relationships, and things of nature, to have people come back and say that they listened to what you said, took you by it, and it changed your life, that's my influence to me. And I always want to come into the room, have an impact with people, and share people's lives. Want to show your goals, what your expectations are, and how you want to be remembered. I always say your dash. What does your dash say about you? When people come to People Connect podcast, I want to feel connected. I want to feel like this is where you need to be, and podcasts that you listen. So really went back down to be true who you are, what you do, for your goals, set them expeditiously, set them broad, big, large, and continue to grow and listen to people say to you, and observe, and always be a caveat of change.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for
We have
my
one
fellow
question in
panelists.
there. I think
We're out of time, unfortunately.
Oh, snap. My bad.
So, but thank all my fellow panelists, for all the people who have attended, for all the people who have done this amazing, amazing festival. And I hope that whatever other panels you listen to tonight, that they provide you great insight and inspiration for you in the work that you guys are doing. So thank you, and I'll see you around later.